Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks. Hey, if you're looking for teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, but you'd like to remember them in high quality jersey or uniform format, hey, some of those teams were legendary, some of them were disasters, but they all live at Royal Retros. Check them out. RoyalRetros.com. Use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Check them out now. And now, check out this episode.
The International Skating Derby presents Roller Superstars, featuring the world-famous, world champion Los Angeles Thunderbirds. In today's game, from Tokyo, Japan, the Thunderbirds take on the powerful Tokyo Bomber team. Hi, I'm Elmer Anderson with Ralphie Valadares here. We're going to talk about a team that has surprised everybody in the world of bank track skating, the Tokyo Bombers. They are small, they're fast, they're aggressive, and they possess an ingredient called pride. And Ralph, that's a great big part of winning.
That's right, Elmer. And I tell you, the Japanese are noted for having pride, and certainly the Tokyo Bombers do have plenty of it. And I'm not saying that the Thunderbirds don't have pride, because we certainly do have pride. We have pride because we have been world champions for many, many years, and I tell you how much pride we have. When a Thunderbird skater, or say a rookie from the training school, puts on a T-Bird jersey, that person has much pride, Elmer, just for the mere fact that he's skating with a T-Bird.
Well, the fact that the Tokyo Bomber team does not have a huge, big John Johnson on the team, they have all concentrated on skaters that look like they all came from the same mold.
Well, that's right.
Is that good for a team?
Well, I tell you, we don't have the small skaters the Tokyo team has, but we're pretty tricky. I've seen a lot of skaters come out, a lot of tricks come out of the Thunderbird skaters, and I tell you, they're very tricky, and the Tokyo team, I've learned much from the T-Birds.
Well, watching them from our announcing booth, we have found that they are very agile. They tumble, they roll, they do a good job, but they come right back.
Well, I tell you what, they work hard at what they're doing, and they're going to be a great team in the future. I think they're good now.
Okay, Ralph, well, we're going to see how good they really are, because in just 1 minute, we'll be back with action with the Tokyo Bombers and the T-Birds.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right. Hey now, what is going on, everybody? It's your pal, Tim Hanlon. It is Good Seats Still Available. The curious, very curious, always curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thanks for finding us, downloading us, putting us in your earbuds, whatever you're doing to ingest the proceedings this week. And we're going to squint hard again on what professional means, not unlike our episode a few weeks back on quote-unquote professional wrestling. We are going deep down a rabbit hole of a topic that has been on the periphery for yours truly for a long, long time. Not really something on my radar when I was a kid growing up and getting deep into the televised spectacle that is and was roller derby. Well, is it roller games? Or there's a lot of different sort of ideations of this high-banked circular roller game kind of orientation. It's a sport slash spectacle that dates back to, turn of the century, turn of the 1900s, in the 1930s, 1940s, and has had many, many, many ups and downs and sidewayses over the many decades. And as very robust, largely female-oriented, more grassroots and amateur kind of activity with real sports-esque scoring and rules and that kind of stuff. But we're going to kind of get into I guess you could call it the glory days, the heyday, or certain elements of that heyday of this thing known as collectively as roller derby, or by some trademark names like roller games. And we'll get into all the sort of distinctions of that. But before we get there, let's tell you who's on the show this week. His name is Scott Stevens, and it is the story of perhaps one of the most famous, if not the most famous, teams to dot the landscape of roller derby / roller games, and that's the LA T-Birds, the Los Angeles Thunderbirds. The book he wrote a handful of years back is called Rolling Thunder, the golden age of roller derby and the rise and fall of the LA T-Birds. Scott Stevens actually was on this team back in the late 70s and early 1980s, but as we'll find out in our conversation coming up, that was one of the sort of during the, I guess you could say, maybe the troughs and the resurrection, I guess, of the team in its, I don't know, third, maybe fourth incarnation. But if you grew up in the Los Angeles metropolitan area, certainly in the 1960s, 1970s, early 1980s, if not even before and afterwards, the Los Angeles Thunderbirds was very much part of your sports lexicon. You had very large audiences, both attending at the Olympic Auditorium there. Also was a place for wrestling and boxing matches. Dick Lane, very familiar name to sports fans in that part of the country, was a name synonymous with roller derby and all kinds of people and many celebrities, if you will. On that clip that you just heard from 1974, back in during another trough, if you will. This is after roller derby, the original brand name, started up by the legendary Jerry Seltzer, the Roller Derby League in San Francisco, and Roller Games was a creation that sort of came in the early 60s as a competition to that original roller derby thing. So that's hence some of the confusion, roller derby and roller games. But the clip that we just heard was from Roller Games, which was the competitor, if you will, that ultimately brought down roller derby around that time. And we'll get into the competitive issues and the nature of that. Hall of Fame members, yes, it's Hall of Fame, Roller Derby Hall of Fame. Elmer Anderson on the call with legendary T-Birds player, performer, coach, Ralph Valadares, who was, both of them were kind of minor celebrities in LA sports circles. And the T-Birds were a regular fixture in various forms on not only Los Angeles television, but across the country in the, I would basically say largely the UHF era of television. A lot of independent stations would carry roller derby, not unlike professional wrestling at the time. There were occasional network dalliances along the way, sort of these manufactured networks and stuff. It was largely a syndicated kind of phenomena. But make no mistake, late night television in particular on the weekends, the spectacle is putting it mildly, of roller derby / roller games, whatever you want to call it, roller sports, if you will, on these banked curves with amazing personalities and outsized egos and storylines that occasionally would put professional wrestling to shame. But we're going to go deep into this story. It is mesmerizing to watch, and I was just frankly just gobsmacked by just the sheer number of clips that are out there on the interwebs when it comes to roller derby, and just watching some of these matches and stuff, and the excitement is very much front and center, and of course the outrageousness of the storylines and the people involved and stuff too, and some of the sort of semi-comic violence, if you will, of scoring those points and all of that kind of stuff. But you will be enthralled by this discussion, this chat with Scott Stevens coming up as we talk about roller derby, roller games, whatever you want to call it, and in particular the Los Angeles Thunderbirds. It's fascinating, and I think we proverbially just scratched the surface of this story, and all kinds of idiosyncrasies and nooks and crannies that will roll over. And if you're a big fan of roller derby and roller games and all that kind of stuff, you'll love this. And again, I implore you, even if you vaguely remember this on your television screens as a child, you must get this book if you don't already have it. And again, it's called Rolling Thunder: The Golden Age of Roller Derby and the Rise and Fall of the LA T-Birds. Again, by our guest this week, Scott Stevens. You can get a copy of it wherever you find good books. And of course, we encourage you to go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 346 with Scott Stevens, and you will find a convenient few links to Amazon to get this book either in hardcover or paperback or Kindle versions as fast as humanly possible. And we'll get a couple of shekels of referral love. We appreciate that, of course. And we hope you enjoy that narrative as much as we did in preparation for this conversation coming up right now. Here's our chat we had with Scott just a few weeks back in early part of April. Let's talk about some roller derby, shall we? Please, as always, enjoy. My understanding, right, which is, I wouldn't call it intermediate, but probably beginner, right, is that roller derby is the sort of original, shall we say, sport or definitional term of what this is and was and now again is. And then there's this thing called roller games, which was, my understanding is it would be a league essentially that sort of came along to challenge the original thing. So maybe a little of introductory understanding of maybe the evolution of this sport, because I think a lot of people of today's generation kind of think of it as sort of a pro wrestling adjacent thing with more entertainment than it is sport. But the reality is very different from its origins.
Right. So, yeah, you're right. Roller derby was the original league, and thus that's where the name comes from, since it was there for so long before anybody really came along to challenge it. And so that's the sport. It's roller derby, which was also a league. And then in 1960, an outlaw league was formed by Bill Griffiths and a couple other people, and that was roller games. And that's where that was based in Los Angeles, whereas roller derby was always based, for the most part, it was based in the Bay Area. It was based in New York City earlier on. So roller games came along and challenged it, and they pulled a lot of skaters from the other league. So there was a good mix of pro skaters to start right off for that league.
Yeah, but roller derby though is almost like wrestling back in the day, right? Especially when early television was coming online, was very much a popular sport. And would you characterize the pre-competitive leagues era as more sport than entertainment? I mean, is that fair to say, with rules and competitiveness and shall we say, I want to say lack of theatrics, but much more on a limited and maybe not even basis?
Well, I look at roller derby as sports entertainment as far as the professional. We can designate professional versus the amateur roller derby of today. Amateur roller derby is a completely legit sport. I wouldn't call it sports entertainment. I think they have a hard time in some ways getting enough entertainment value for their fans. It's a tough sport to do completely legitimately, and that's a whole different story. Oftentimes defense really prevails in the sport. So roller games and roller derby, those original leagues, once they got out of the 1930s, there was legitimacy in the 1930s, but it wasn't the same sport as it evolved. In the 40s and 50s, they started adding theatrics to the sport, and little by little, that's what was filling the seats. It's not that different in a way to me I always knew growing up as a kid, if I went to an LA Kings game, I'm going to see a fight. And I used to think, those guys can't beat the crap out of each other every night and not go to the hospital. But you just knew you were going to get that side of sports entertainment in that sport as well. But roller derby became more exaggerated. So they went much further with that entertainment aspect. And I think it worked really well as long as they had well-trained athletes to compete. There was a lot of hard skating, hard hitting, a great sport, as well as theatrical and lots of entertainment, very fast moving, exciting to be on the track, and very exciting to watch. I mean, I grew up a big fan of all the LA sports teams and San Diego teams because I was, LA's only a couple hours from San Diego, and I liked the underdog teams, the Padres and the Chargers were very strong back then. Of course, they had a great AFL run. But, I followed roller derby and put it on the same level as the Dodgers and the Rams at that time and the Lakers. For me, they were, as a young kid, I believed in Santa Claus, and I really thought this was the coolest sport. So I put on skates and started, really getting into roller skating. And as a matter of fact, I just skated all over Toronto this morning after I woke up. I'm still skating, but street skating is where it started for me and a lot of people. But what I always wondered is, I would look in the LA Times and I'd see all the standings. Dodgers are, in second place, Giants are in first place. And I'm like, where is roller games? Where are the standings? And I started to question it. I started to wonder what is going on. And there was this period as I'm like sort of a preteen where I started to realize, okay, there's a lot of theatrics in this sport. Some of the stuff's not quite looking like it's 100% real, but I still loved it and wished that it was that much more legit and that they would have standings and teams skating in various cities. But it was sports entertainment, and I think it was one of the best. And I would say that I've been to all the different sporting events, and I've never been more excited than being at a roller derby game, hearing those skates along the bank track, the wood track. It makes just a great noise in the arena, and fans just really get riled up at the Olympic Auditorium. That was the home of the LA T-Birds. And there was really nothing like it. Whether or not it was scripted and so forth, it was always exciting. You always knew you had a great ending to the game. And no matter what you thought, you're going to be on your feet at the end of those periods and at the end of the game. Very exciting sport night. I wrote the book because I felt like it had not been properly covered. Roller games had very little coverage, and the LA T-Birds specifically, which is the marquee team of roller games, really didn't have anything much written about them. There was some books that covered the Bay Bombers and the Roller Derby League, which I have huge respect for and love those guys and that particular operation where they started it all. But, in a nutshell, it's a real exciting sports entertainment.
So that's really interesting. The whole notion of you, evolving through your understanding of this quote unquote sport, at least in your mind, right? And I don't know, I guess growing up, if you will, through the ignorance or the avoidance, shall we say, of the coverage, that is lack of coverage in sports media at the time for this, right? So that's interesting. That's a tough way to kind of maybe realize or understand that perhaps this this sport that you're becoming attracted to isn't quote unquote really a sport.
Yeah, it's true. It was, it was just something I had to come to realize. And I think for a lot of kids probably did it the same way. They grew up watching the T-Birds in the heyday of that late 60s period when they were very young. And then they hit preteens, they started to figure it out. They still liked it. And then as I hit the teenage years, it coincided. So I was 13 in 1973, and roller games started to falter a bit. Roller derby, the original league, folded. A lot of this had to do with the high cost of gasoline and people not coming to the arenas anymore because they didn't want to spend the gas money to get there. That's one of the reasons. I wrote a chapter about it in the book, but roller games continued as Bill Griffith absorbed a lot of those top marquee skaters that they had on the Bay Bombers and other teams, like the Pioneers in that league. But it started in 1974, his league started to fold, and by the end of that year, it was gone. And I think a lot of people that followed it didn't really know what happened. Suddenly it just wasn't on TV. There wasn't, because the news media didn't cover things like this, you couldn't really hear anything about it. We didn't have social media. There was no groups that would be chatting about it. It just suddenly vanished. And I've talked to a lot of people that just felt like, where did my roller games go? What happened? But I was also at that point where I discovered, rock and roll and girls, and I was fading out of it anyways. knowing, what it was. So for a couple of years, I didn't really follow that much. I missed not seeing it. But then it came back, a couple of years later. Bill Griffiths, John Hall, and Ralphie Valadares endeavored to bring it back, and they started training skaters around early 1976. And later in 1976, I heard about that and I started training. I really didn't know what had happened. I thought the T-Birds had always been there. I didn't know they had gone out of business. I didn't know it all stopped. I just, at that point, okay, I know what it is, but I want to skate. I love skating. So I started training, and then it made its comeback. But I was super naive back in those days about what was really going on and how much they were struggling to make ends meet and rebuilding this league that was on its knees, basically.
Okay, but before we get to that, because that's obviously a crucial part of your personal experiences with all this, take us back a step to your understanding of the early 1960s when roller games was created as a challenger to roller derby trademark, and a sense maybe of the 60s because of that. Because in LA in particular, Southern California, right? I guess you could say that the T-Birds golden era was kind of that. And I think it's lost on people outside the Southland that just how gigantically popular this team and this, let's call it, sport was. And to the point where this is as popular, if not more popular than anything professional sports in that region, and maybe arguably spilling out to other parts of the country.
Yes, Tim. Interesting. Sometimes the T-Birds would skate and draw, on a night where they would draw more fans than the Lakers would draw at the sports arena, and they drew more than the Kings oftentimes. I'm not going to say they outdrew the Rams in the Coliseum or anything, but they were a big deal, and just about everybody knew certain names from the T-Birds during that time, just like you knew who Willie Davis was and Sandy Koufax and so forth. You knew Ralphie Valadares and Shirley Hardman and Danny Riley. Those people were household names, and it was huge. It was overwhelming. It was just incredible back then in the 60s. But it peaked about 1972. I would say that was probably their banner year, but it was building up the entire time to that peak. And 68 to 72 was really big. And those early years in the 60s, great talent, much less theatrics and showmanship. There was still a lot more than in other sports, but it wasn't as prevalent, which I think was a good thing. It was a little more balanced. Actually, all the way up until it folded, I think they had a good level of showmanship versus skating skills and legitimacy. And then as they tried to rebuild the thing with less skating talent, they were putting together more antics and so forth. And that also hurt the sport. But yeah, back to your point, the 60s was huge. And, what a time to be in LA with the Dodgers just coming on. They won, World Series, and they were in the World Series so many times back then. And it was Tommy and Willie Davis and Koufax and Drysdale. And what a team. And then the Rams had a super strong team, of course, with Gabriel and all his entourage. And the Lakers were in the finals almost every year playing the Celtics, with Wes Baylor and eventually Chamberlain finally winning in 72, that same year in 72. But LA was just this city where everybody wanted to be. And other than the horrible smog of those days, it was a really exciting town to be in. And the T-Birds were part of that. And everybody knew them. And when they went away, everybody was scratching their heads, what happened to the T-Birds?
Okay, so we're not going to. So give me a sense then of the 60s, again, based on your knowledge. Obviously, this is before you're even on the scene, so to speak. Just how big it was, right? I mean, this was like on local television. It was selling out this this venue, this 9,000 seat venue, the Olympic, which you could talk about. But it also it feels to me like these two rival leagues now were really kind of. Shall I say, good for each other? And the T-Birds were in the roller games part of that, right? And roller derby had its own set of teams. I guess Bay City in San Francisco, the Bombers were kind of their sort of major franchise. So a couple of questions there. Number one, give us a sense of like just how big this kind of was. And number two, did these teams ever play? These leagues ever compete with each other? And do you think that it was healthy at the time, maybe having that challenge between two leagues that made it even more of a thing versus just being a fallow only league with roller derby?
Right, right. Well, as far as how big it was, it's a sport that works really well for TV. So the biggest part of the T-Birds audience was the television audience. Not only was it shown in Los Angeles, but it was syndicated around the country. And so the T-Birds had the Southern California market big time, and then the Bay Bombers and roller derby had it up in San Francisco, and they were also syndicated. And generally, they avoided crossing paths in certain towns. So if you were to go to, let's say Chicago, you'll probably find that one of those two teams or leagues was being televised there. And then they would tour there in their off season. They would go and do they would play games in whatever town it was that they were getting television coverage. But it was, as I say, it was competing with the Lakers and the Kings, and it was to that level of how big it was. And everybody knew Dick Lane, the announcer. And the Olympic was packed, but there was a segment of the population that maybe didn't even want to go down to that part of Los Angeles, unfortunately.
Just for our audience, where was the Olympic located in relation to the downtown LA, et cetera? Where is it geographically?
Yeah, it's on 18th and Grand. It is in the city, close to the city center. It's at that time, I feel like I always felt fine being in that area, but my parents didn't take us to a game. Ironically, I never attended a game once. They would just say, "No, we're not gonna. It's not safe now. Not gonna go to a game." But but most people did watch it on TV. And I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, so everybody I knew the T-Birds, and very few of them went to games. But they drew a lot of people from those inner cities. Many inner cities in Los Angeles, and it was so important to those people down there. And I really pointed that out a lot in the book. And they just felt they had an attachment. They were really attached to the team. The team, they didn't feel like the team was above them. They were on the same level. They could talk to the skaters, and the diversity of the T-Birds worked really well for the inner city, obviously. And the T-Birds were covered a lot in like those newspapers that covered the Hispanic markets and the African American markets, and the place would be packed with inner city people, and it was just a wonderful experience. For me, that was one of the things I liked the most when I was a skater. It's just, I could just tell we're bringing this huge amount of joy to that segment of the population, because tickets, I don't remember the prices exactly, but very inexpensive. So you're going to spend less money getting into the Olympic to see the T-Birds than you would to see the Lakers at the sports arena back then, or these other teams. So it was a very affordable, exciting night out for Angelenos.
It sounds more accessible, right? And more related, if you will, to the community. And I'm guessing the prices too, and the availability, as you mentioned, some of these players and stuff. It probably was a lot more intentional.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you look at today's sports. I mean, these guys are just making ungodly amounts of money, and it has to go to their head to some degree. I mean, back in those days, ball players did well. They were above the average for sure. They were upper middle class. There's no such thing as middle class in sports, professional sports anymore. It's just filthy rich on a whole different level. So it would be hard to relate to those guys. So they can throw a pitch or catch a ball well and hit the ball well. But there's a whole different argument as to whether or not it's worth paying people that kind of money. I just always felt like nowadays it's hard for me to watch some of the sports because of what it's become. And there is so much showmanship that, there was so much more composure back in the 60s and the 70s. It was just a different thing. And I really loved that era. And I felt like the talent was just as great. They just didn't make as much money, but they were certainly doing fine. Roller
Yeah,
derby was a rung below that in what they paid the skaters, because you got to realize there was a men's and a women's team on both sides. So you had a lot of skaters there. You probably had 7 on each squad, 7 men, 7 women. So that's 14. Between 25 and 30 skaters that you had to pay. But it was a paid sport. People made their living. They toured. They skated about 3 nights a week, typically, which is a lot. I don't know. Back when I skated, we didn't skate as much as that. I don't know how their bodies handled it, because I had felt what it's like to recover from a game, and I don't think I could recover in 1 or 2 days. Just as the NFL is not going to play 2 games a week. Well, roller games, like I said, I wouldn't have wanted to skate back then. It was just too brutal to not have a week off to recover. But they did. They skated. They made a living. And the difference between that game and today's game, the amateur sport that it is now, which is mostly skated on flat track, is that they're not paid and they're doing it completely legitimately. So it's just such a different animal, but the basics of the sport are the same. And I'm really glad to see that they have continued and kept the sport going, but very different.
Well, a quick sidebar on this. Let's talk about the athleticism, right? Because, and I think pro wrestling sort of fits into this as well, because while the entertainment, again, in this era that we're talking about, the entertainment component is certainly very strong, but the reality is a lot of what you're describing is these are real human beings who have to perform at a relatively high level on a very consistent and maybe overtaxed basis in terms of maneuvering, in terms of speed, in terms of athletic agility, maybe even dexterity in a scripted format to make sure that they don't miss a blow or a clothesline or some prescribed kind of movement and stuff. The reality is that the body doesn't know amateur from professional, from scripted, from actual, right? It just knows that it can only go so far. Can you speak a little to what you understood, that the need, the athleticism and the travel and that kind of stuff in this heyday? And then maybe personally too, which we'll finally get to in a few minutes, your own toll as you did it when you were in the mixing bowl in the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah. So as far as the talent goes, T-Birds and those teams in both leagues were stacked with very high level professional talent. When we're talking the 60s and the 70s, it was just on any level with any other professional sport. These guys really could skate, guys and girls, I should say. But skating every other night or 2 or 3 times a week, certainly I know that there was a lot of injuries and people that would be out. But the star quality, the athleticism was extreme. And that was one of my favorite things when I was skating, is to see the amount of talent that was out there. Guys like Sam Washington, Ralphie, Danny, Billy Marshall, Greg Robertson, George Fernandez, Glenn Miller was outstanding back then. I don't know if you recognize any of these names, but some of the great T-Birds, Terry Lynch, Honey Sanchez, Carmen Thompson, many of them in the Hall of Fame now. And I may have missed the second part of your question. Sorry.
No, well, I mean, so that's your understanding. What about your? You sort of alluded to it before. I mean, how was your body taxed when you were doing it in the late 70s, early 80s? Obviously, it was a different version of the team and that kind of stuff, but I got to think the physicality was no different in that respect. The needs and the demands on your body no different, and maybe you weren't traveling as much. But how did you hold up? I mean, because it's got to be a punishment over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think was my youth was keeping me on the track, and just, you recover pretty fast. I started training at about age 16. I got in my first game at age 18, and I finished up around 21, and I had numerous injuries. I had water on both elbows. I had water on both hips. I had broken ribs, broken jaw. And I just felt like, if I keep doing this, I'm not going to be able to walk well when I'm a little bit older. And so, yeah, it was grueling, but the training which is all legit and hardcore. I loved going to training, but I would come out of it always bruised, often bleeding. But I craved the training that they did in Pico Rivera at the T-Birds Rollerdrome, called the T-Bird Rollerdrome. And it was fantastic. And we had wonderful professional trainers. Ralphie trained us, John Hall trained us. And everybody, I think, that is a lot of skaters' fondest memory is the training and becoming a skater, learning the tricks of the trade, and they trained hard. You were exhausted by the end of the training. Training, I don't think I know I didn't have exceptional talent. I wasn't a natural. I was just a kid that skated, inspired by the T-Birds. Since about 66, I had skates on. 5 or 6 years old. So I had enough experience to get around on my skates pretty well, but not the kind of natural ability that the stars eventually have. I don't think I was going to ever become a star. So I think stepping back and looking at it from that perspective, I probably had a greater appreciation of the talent that was out there, knowing for me to get to the highest level in this sport would be very, very difficult. And but I was ready to go. At 21, I just thought, this is, for what we're getting paid, it's just not worth getting beat up. I love it, but at the same time, I know I'm not going to sustain this for very long. So yeah, it was grueling for sure.
Yeah, and at that age, physically, you mentally too, you're invincible, right? You don't know what you don't know, and on all that stuff. All right, so but before we literally dig into your personal experiences with the team, then I think it's really important to understand what was going on as a prelude in the 70s, right? Because in 1972, the originator of all of this, the roller derby league and system, closed its doors. It went away. It folded. I don't know what the full story of that was, but the competitiveness of two leagues was down to just to roller games. Now, I guess the question there is, I think we know what sort of happened, but it would seem at the time that might not have, I guess that was either a bad thing or potentially good thing, depending on which side of the aisle you were on and where your investments were. But by 75 or so, roller games met its own demise. So maybe give us a background and some understanding of sort of the tumultuousness of that, leading into what ultimately became your opportunity later.
Right. Yeah. So I think everybody was shocked when roller derby shut its doors. It had been going since the 1930s. Leo Seltzer started it. Jerry Seltzer continued it, his son, and it seemed to be doing really well. And they also had their biggest years in that late 60s, early 70s period. So then everything just fell off a cliff. And a lot of it had to do with the gas prices. I don't think either league was deep with cash reserves. So they just weren't able to withstand this period and pay the skaters and keep everything going, all of their expenses that they had, without a good cash reserve. And they didn't have franchises. So, and that's something that is unfortunate. They never went into franchises. I think both Jerry Seltzer and Bill Griffiths held very tightly onto the reins of their leagues, and probably really needed or wanted to have a lot of control, probably too much control. So when things got rough, there was nobody to lean on. And Jerry just said, I'm getting out of it. And I don't think he wanted to take any bigger loss than what he was taking. And his skaters were shocked. Bill Griffiths picked up the best of those skaters, brought them to roller games. And you would think that he would really benefit from that. But the skating groups didn't mix that well together. Roller games was a little more theatrical than roller derby. Now both leagues were theatrical and had scripted plays and endings and so forth. But roller games went a little further, and I think some of the skaters on that side didn't like it as much because of that.
I would suggest that maybe there was real animus. I don't know how manufactured that was, but it almost feels like the two leagues were not friendly with each other.
Some of the skaters went back and forth over the years. Somebody like Ann Calvello, she skated a long time, and she came over to roller games, and she went back. A lot of the skaters just went, whoever was going to pay him the most. And a lot of skaters loved the theatrics, and some of them didn't. So it wasn't just one that everybody disliked everybody or looked down on the other league. In a general sense, there was that competitive thing going on. But I think as far as the skaters go, they just wanted to work. They loved the bank track. The essence of the sport was the same. All it was a little bit more theatrical in roller games. Not a huge disparity. And I don't think there was a lot of competition. I don't think like when the Bay Bombers and roller derby shut down, that it was a huge boon for roller games. Both leagues were doing really well at that point, as good as they've ever done. And I think it was when on all these additional skaters, it might have had a burden for him that he wasn't really ready for. And then he crashed, it crashed and burned 2 years later, which was really shocking. Looking back, it's still shocking that they couldn't keep it going. But then they rebuilt again, and that's a whole different story.
All right, what's this? Royal Retros. All right, longtime fans of this show may remember a little site that we used to promote the heck out of called 503 Sports. Well, not only are they still around, they are now known as Royal Retros. RoyalRetros.com, the king of throwbacks. And like the name implies, the highest quality jerseys and hats and apparel and all kinds of stuff related to various teams and leagues and situations that we love to obsess about here on this show. And I'm talking about getting jerseys with your name and number on the back of them, customized to your liking for the WHA or old NHL hockey teams that may not exist anymore. Perhaps it's a Federal League team from way back or a Negro League team. Maybe you're just enamored with the various football leagues of the past, like the Arena League or the All-American Football Conference or the original UFL, United Football League. Yes, you can get all of those teams in all kinds of colors, away jerseys, home jerseys. You want to put your name on them. You want to make sure you got the official patch on the side. All of those things and more at RoyalRetros.com. And I'm not kidding, friends. You go there, you want to find that Cleveland Barons jersey to wear and show. Hey, you're maybe a Colorado Avalanche fan and you want to represent the Quebec Nordiques from where they came in the arena to show your heritage and your love and knowledge of the history of that franchise. You can do that and more. And I'm talking across football and basketball and baseball and hockey and you name it. All kinds of great stuff for you to find and buy and purchase and wear proudly from Royal Retros. That's RoyalRetros.com. And of course, we have a promo code for you. We want to save you money from all these great things. And here's that code. It's SEATS, SEATS, promo code SEATS for all of your purchases at RoyalRetros.com. Check them out. You'll be glad you did. We love them. And our friend Destin Alameda there out in Portland, Oregon, we appreciate his and their sponsorship of this show. And now, back to our conversation. Well, okay, so literally we now go from, you're saying, sort of almost the peak, the apex, the heyday of the late 60s, early 70s. And within a span of 3 years, you lose both leagues, the originator in 72 with roller derby and the instigator, the challenger of roller games in 1975. And back to what you were talking about earlier, it's gone, right? And again, in a 1975, pre-internet, pre-cable television kind of era, right? Not easy to discern the whys of that occurrence, and where does the diaspora go? Where do fans go? Where do the players go? It seems like sort of a lost wilderness period of time. What happens in that immediate aftermath that you were able to learn as you got older, and what were the seeds of this rebirth or reattempt that ensnared you in a few years thereafter?
Well, the skaters were out of work. That was suddenly they didn't have employment. They didn't have an income.
But I'm
And
sorry, this was their livelihoods at this point. I mean, that's how good it was. I mean, they didn't have other jobs, really?
well, you're real familiar with the AFL, right? And leagues from those eras. And a lot of those players, had jobs in the off season,
Right.
right?
It was like a lunch pail kind of deal. Absolutely. Off-season
Right.
work. Absolutely.
So, a lot of the roller game skaters had jobs when they weren't skating, but the skating season lasted pretty long. So most of them were sustained exclusively from the games they were skating and their salaries from roller games, but they would take on some other jobs. It was enough to get by, and everybody that I've talked to that was in that era has nothing but great things to say. And it was literally the time of their lives, and they were shocked when it just was gone. And it's
And
really
I'm sorry, there was no inkling, no warning, nobody seemed to know it was teetering, maybe?
in neither league really put out a message that, hey, we're going to skate for another 2 months and then we're shutting it down. I know when Seltzer pulled the plug on it, I think he told the skaters, this will be your last game. And that was it. I don't think anybody knew beforehand, and it wasn't that much difference. Griffiths with the T-Birds just stopped booking games, and there was just no more games, and he just pulled away from it because I'm sure it was a cash flow thing. He wasn't making the money. So yeah, he was pretty brutal for these people that were, especially the ones that were fringe skaters. People like myself. If I would have been in that league at that point, I wouldn't have any expectations or big disappointments but the people that really had the talent, that had spent their whole life in the sport, developing a real high level of skill in something. And there's no place else you can use that skill. So you are completely out. When roller games shut down, there was no options. There was no other league to go to. So it was just unbelievable for those skaters, and tragedy in a lot of ways for many of them. And then the comeback helped out, but it was never the same.
What comes out of that? Because this is also interesting and a little ironic, because there were some actual other sort of pop culture things that were going on at the time. Like, for example, this movie with Raquel Welch, Kansas City Bomber, right? That came out in what, early 70s, 72 maybe ish.
72, yeah, and it helped to spur on the best year that they had ever had, but they were already on a roll. The movie was influenced, the creation of the movie had a lot to do with how big of a thing roller derby had become across the country. It was time to make a movie about it. So they captured it right at the pinnacle of the whole thing. And then it increased the crowds in the arenas all throughout the country for a time being. That's what was also so shocking. It's just, year after that movie comes out and they're playing the sold out arenas all over the country, suddenly, boom, it's over.
So who's part of putting this back together again? I mean, did this emanate out of the T-Birds diaspora specifically? Were there other people involved in roller games and or roller derby that somehow found or scraped together some money? Was it who was sort of part of reconstituting something going forward out of this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tim. It was two skaters out of roller games that had been really the most important people behind the scenes, just behind the owner, Bill Griffiths, during the 60s and 70s. These guys, one was John Hall and the other was Ralphie Valadares. And they leased a roller rink in Pico Rivera, basically took it over as open to the public roller skating rink. They put a bank track in there, and they started training skaters. And it eventually led to, some of the older skaters dropping by for some training sessions. But in 1975 and early 76, there was no assurance that this was going to go anywhere. And they were running it as a roller skating rink. And then and they were doing pretty well with it, and they were starting to put teams together, and they had, of course, the dream of bringing it back. I think Bill Griffiths got hold of what was going on, heard about it, and he came and got involved again. I don't know where he was financially, but I'm sure he injected some cash into the thing and helped get it up and running. But it was really John and Ralphie who made that happen, brought that league back, because they took it from the bottom of the heap, the scraps, and they built it enough so Griffiths could come in and go, okay, I can work with this. These guys have a training facility. They did it all by themselves, because training skaters is the number one most important thing in my mind, to have a sustainable league, because there is not bank tracks in every city. You can't just go to a bank track like you can to a field, to a baseball field to practice baseball, or to a court to play basketball, or even to an ice rink to play hockey. There's no such thing. There's only a handful of bank tracks around the country. So they had one, and that was the foundation of starting up this new league. So then Griffiths came in and they trained the skaters, and they started to schedule games again back at the Olympic. And for people that didn't know that it completely shut down, it would have just looked like, okay, they were always there. I don't know why I didn't see them, but here they are again. But in the beginning, they had to get a TV deal, and KTLA, Channel 5, and also Channel 9 was always involved. Those two stations were always involved with the T-Birds, and I can't remember which one, but they were back on TV, and that's what really helped. So I'm sure Griffiths helped arrange the television deal, because sport just isn't viable without TV. That's how people know about the games, and so because it's not covered in the media. So without TV, it's not going to work. And that's part of what led to its demise, is that they lost TV contracts as it started to falter, and they lost advertisers. That's a long story. But when they came back, they slowly got those things back. As I've said before, never to the level where it was in the 60s and early 70s. They never reached that level, but they did bring it back, and it was a real valiant effort, and it continued. So you're talking about 1975 through to 1989. It was pretty good. I mean, it was the number one league in roller derby, the sport, throughout that period. Now, roller derby also made a comeback, but not quite to the level that roller games made their comeback.
So a couple of things to unpack there. So number one, this sounds like it was a player salvation, so to speak. People like Ralphie Valderas and others basically saying, no, there's some real there. And I guess the question in there is, why did Griffiths turn it off in the first place? And how do you explain him coming back so quickly? Was he always looking for sort of this validation and this sort of, or did it need maybe that sort of, it almost felt dramatic, right? Like I could see a melodrama here, right? Where it's like, I give up, I'm giving, this is it. We can't go any further. And people going to him, essentially showing him that, no, there's real goodness to this and an opportunity to go forward. And that's what it takes to get him back in the fold. I guess I'm just trying to get into his head as to why he closed it off and then somehow, somewhat quickly, it seems, come back once other people showed him about it.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I only was able to talk to him a couple times. I did spend time talking to his son, Bill Griffiths Jr., but I never really got those answers. I wasn't able to get into his head, and he passed away in the 90s, long before I had thought about doing the book, but I wasn't starting to do interviews, and it was a long time after that. It was 2018 when I think around the time I finished the book. So I don't have the answers. I don't know what was in his head. I can only speculate. But I do know that he loved being part of it. He loved the T-Birds. It was the love of his life. I'm sure he missed it quite a bit. And this is all speculation, and I'm sure in the good days there was money to be made. It was profitable. So I'm sure he was hoping that it would get back to where it was. I think everybody was hoping But I don't think there was ever a, a bunch of money made after that time. I mean, nobody was making bank from in that entire period. They were surviving, which is great. Skaters were getting paid, but not nearly as much. I'm going to guess about 25% of what they would have been making, or 50 max of what they made in the heyday. So nothing compared to it. And I'm sure some of the skaters were complaining about what they were getting paid, but I have a sense that the owners were not making a whole lot of money, that nobody was making a lot of money during that period. So you can only pay out what you have, what you make, and they didn't have it.
Well, but the passion, right, and the ability to play, we actually can still play. And I also think really interesting and important to understand, and maybe in the moment it was not so obvious, but maybe in hindsight it is. You're talking about 1975, mid 70s, right? So this is the beginning of the heyday. Well, I would say the heyday of independent television stations in this country, right? I mean, around that time, right, you had the three major networks, and if you were blessed to live, that's debatable, in a major market in the United States, you may have a couple, or in the case of New York or Los Angeles, more than a couple independent TV stations, and the need for programming in those stations, right? Syndication, television, and all kinds of different sort of things. And station managers literally had to go out there and find programs that would sort of float their boat, so to speak, right? And I know the Thunderbirds hooked up with, I guess, this Kaiser Broadcasting entity at the time. Had I guess a fledgling UHF station at the time, and the ability, frankly, and the interest of some of these independent stations who were hungry for attractive programming, right, to bring roller derby back, if you will, or roller games back, and have that as a feature set on their fledgling programming offerings, right? So in a weird way, it seems like there's a recognition, and it looked like it was a pretty quick scenario where a bunch of stations in the Kaiser family quickly sort of added these games, right? That the recognition that television was important in all of this, and obviously we know how important it is today, and all the money that's sort of become it. But it almost feels timely that would be sort of maybe the lifeline, this television thing, albeit in small UHF, hard to receive signals.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Tim. I kind of forgot about that in the beginning of the comeback, that it was UHF station. I'm sure it's in the book. I don't remember. I've forgotten a lot of it now. It was, so heavy into the research of.
Hey, that's what we're here for. Come on, Scott.
You just got to keep educating me on this stuff. But that's a great point, because those stations that were hard often to tune in is where it was being carried, and those fans that could get the game on TV would end up at the Olympic Auditorium in attending, and that helped get it going. It was a few years later they got back on a regular, LA local network, like a 5 or a 9. I don't remember which one came first, but in the beginning that was tough. 1977 was when it really started to make its comeback, and they were scheduling regular games, and there was a lot of empty seats at the time, and the skaters were being paid a pittance as what they would have normally made, and many of the older skaters just wouldn't come back. A lot of them were old enough to retire anyway, so when it all kind of went away, because so many of them started in the 50s, so by 1974, 75, they probably felt like, we could I'd call it a career. I think most of them would have liked to have skated another 5 years. All athletes are like that. Nobody wants to retire, right? So they would have liked to, but if you're talking about lowering their income to come back in a rough sport like that with empty seats, a lot of empty seats, a lot of them just said, no, I'm not going to do it. I was a big star. I was on good, great television networks. I was carried everywhere. And people saw what I was doing. And then suddenly they're asking me to come back now for 25% of what I was making. And a lot of them didn't. But then there was some that just loved it so much, they came back. And it's a credit to them, those folks that came back, because the sport wouldn't have continued without them. And then slowly, as it gained momentum, some of the other skaters, that didn't want to come back in the beginning made their comebacks. Not everybody, but some of them did. And it got, the T-Bird team that I was on in the season of 1980, which was really the heyday of the comeback period, was really strong with legacy talent. And it was pretty exciting, incredibly exciting to skate with skaters like that. So it was an exciting time, regardless of whether or not it ever reached that same level. People were invested in it. The skaters that were there really skated hard. That's one thing I can say.
And what was your offer? How did you get the call up, so to speak? How did you get invited to train and then ultimately make the roster? And how was it? Sounds like it was fun, but it had to also be challenging too.
Yeah, I look at it as one of the most exciting times in my life, regardless of the bumps and bruises, and the elation, the emotion of skating to screaming fans, skating for a team that I grew up loving just as much as I love the other LA teams, was real exciting for me, regardless of the fact that I was not a star skater. And that's, part of the book is about that. But yeah, it was, I'm sorry, the first part of your question, I probably already.
No, how did you get invited? Were you at a tryout? Did somebody scout you? Somebody see you rolling down the beach in Huntington? How did you get this, if you will, into the mix?
Right. Gotcha. Good point. So skating around, and I heard some people talking about, I went down and trained with the T-Birds and so on and so forth. And I'm like, wow, the T-Birds have a training facility. And I had completely forgotten that they were even skating at all. And so I talked to the guy and he told me where it was, and don't remember who it was, but then I just went down there to Pico Rivera and found out about it. Walked into that. They had professional classes, for pro skaters and for amateur skaters. They had a couple different levels in the evening that Ralphie and John, for the most part, were the trainers of. So I got in more of the amateur classes and started going. And I was going religiously. I was going several times a week. It was a long drive, let's say, when you had to be a good 90 minutes sometimes with traffic to 2 hours total, there and back, an hour each way. But I was just doing it, as much as I could. What happened is they could see I was dedicated. That I just didn't quit. I took my bumps and bruises and I wanted to do it. I think they were looking for young talent. They probably saw more in me than what I really had. My potential probably had a limit, but they saw me out there doing it. So eventually I got an offer to skate with the Detroit Devils, and I skated some games. I think it was absolutely horrible. Just not ready for prime time. And that's what happened in that era is, I was lucky in a way because I would get that opportunity, and I would have never made a team in the 60s that easily. No chance. The bottom of the barrel, the lower half, like, of each team were really, they weren't the greatest it wasn't the greatest level of talent. Maybe the first 3-4 males and females on each team had professional experience, were very good. Some of them were outstanding. They couldn't pay enough to outfit the team with 6 or 7 professional level skaters. So they would grab people from the training school, like myself, put us out there on the track long before we knew what was going on. And it was bewildering. I was scared out there from a mental standpoint of screwing something up. And that lasted for a good year or two, where I just didn't feel comfortable on the track, especially when they were doing something that might have been scripted, where I had to be in a certain spot. I couldn't keep track of it all. Mentally, this game was overwhelming for me, just to know what was happen next with the scripting, and also trying to keep my skates under me and not fall flat on my face, not get knocked down and have to catch back up to the pack. I was a real wreck for 77, 78, but it was exhilarating. And I thought, okay, well, I've made a team. So that I thought, well, I must have some kind of talent. But it was more because they needed skaters. And I knew that too. But I thought, I'm going to take advantage. Too much fun not to. But as I say, put that same Scott Stevens into the 50s teams or the 60s of roller games or early 70s. I'm not going to make a team. They had minor league teams at that time. LA Dons were their minor league team. And yeah, I would have succeeded with never a professional level team.
I'm sorry, Scott, you dipped out a little bit there. I don't know if you're moving around the microphone and stuff. Can you say again, you're talking about minor league teams?
Yeah, for a period in their heyday, each T-Birds had a minor league team. They were called the LA Dons, and they would skate before the T-Birds games in the same venue, skate at the Olympic, and these were composed of up-and-coming skaters. I never saw a Dons game because they were never televised, and for good reason, I'm sure. And so you would have had to attend the game to see them. But there wasn't the minor league stuff going on when I was skating. So there was no chance to go get game experience in a minor league setting. You just your first game was with the big boys, and it was overwhelming for me. I remember. Just felt like I didn't belong, that I better just not make, all I want to do is not make a huge mistake. And I did make a couple of really big mistakes. And there was one where I won't go into the whole thing, but I got chewed out in the locker room by Ralph. Like, it looked like he was mad enough that he probably wanted to get. I don't even remember all the background of it. I know it was completely innocent, naive, and stupid. Whatever mistake I had made, I didn't even know I made it. But I was just completely, I thought that's going to be my last game, but they let me continue to skate.
So you mentioned before you were on you were on a team, not the T-Birds. That was 1980, but you're mentioning you were on the Detroit team. So were these manufactured teams? Were the actual teams? Give us. It seems like that the LA T-Birds was the center of this revival, and almost the other teams and cities and stuff were. Can I call it manufactured? Not unlike the New Jersey Generals or the Harlem Globetrotters.
Yeah, that's pretty much what it is. I think that's a good analogy there. Detroit Devils didn't skate out of Detroit. The T-Birds may go to Detroit and they may go to Chicago and the other teams, but other cities. But you're right; those were just teams that were, all those skaters were based in Southern California, and so it was great to be on the T-Birds. Of course, I think a lot of skaters would like to skate with the home team and so forth. But there was tremendous talent on those other teams to be able to skate competitively against the T-Birds. T-Birds might have been a little more stacked than some of the other teams, but there was always several great, now Hall of Fame skaters on each of those teams.
Interesting. Very interesting. And but you also then did you would tour too, right? I mean, you were in it wasn't just in the Olympic, right? You were, didn't you also go to places like I see some pictures here online of like a sellout crowd in San Diego, Mexico City games and stuff where you had like 20, 30,000. Were you part of those as well? And was it sounds like touring was very much part of the model.
It was. In the early days, they would tour across the entire country to all the markets where all the television markets that were doing well. They would go in, and the thing about roller games and roller derby and how viable of a sport and how much people love it is wherever they were being televised, the games would generally sell out and draw huge crowds, fanatical fans. And that's why it was so hard to believe that it went under and that it still doesn't carry on today, because there was just a lot of people attending these games. Anytime they went to a city, it would just about sell out. So by the time I was skating, they weren't touring across the country anymore. The TV markets were limited compared to what they were. Where, as you mentioned, the UHF stations and so forth just didn't cut it. They weren't able to spend the money to go out and tour across the country very often. What they would do, they would go to markets that weren't too far away where they knew they had television coverage. So San Diego was one of those. And so we went many times to the San Diego Sports Arena, and it was usually sold out, every single seat, screaming fans. It was some of my favorite games. First of all, I loved San Diego, grew up in LA, and eventually I settled in San Diego. But I was just beside myself skating at a packed sports arena. It was incredible. And then, yeah, we toured, T-Birds toured in other countries. I was fortunate enough to go to Mexico City with them. And again, so we skated like 5 games in Mexico City on consecutive days. So it was brutal. And every one of those, it was, I forgot what the arena was called, but it was the most famous arena in Mexico City. It had a copper dome. And back then it was just the place for sports. And it might have been somewhere around 25,000, I don't know, but it was sold out every night. Screaming, raging fans. It made me believe when I went on these tours that this is a sport that should be bigger than it is. And I always felt that they should have franchised and they should have brought more investors and people in. They should have delegated. And that just was never done. And so every time somebody tries to bring it back, they always have to put a gimmick in with it because in their mind, this is a failed sport. So we've got to do something different when it was never really a failed sport. What the failure in roller games and roller derby was not to expand ownership, not to franchise, not to delegate. It was just they were both run by one guy, and you can only go so far with that and without franchises. And so it was huge, though. Those tours were amazing, and I loved every minute of it.
So that's an interesting way. Maybe we use this as a cul-de-sac here for our conversation. This has been amazing and enlightening. So we don't have to get into the specifics, but there were various attempts. I mean, ESPN and some other stuff, rock and roller games, that kind of stuff. There's actually legit inline hockey, roller hockey international, which was, a takeoff on ice hockey, not the roller derby kind of thing, but certainly a recognition that roller something could be of interest and of compelling nature. But now let's fast forward to today, right? We mentioned there's a vibrant and very culturally significant amateur scene today. Not the banked kind of version, but mostly legit, actually fully legit kind of sport element to it. But we're also in a world of media and internet and streaming and digital media and all those kinds of things. We're seeing, frankly, I think a huge inflation of interest, private equity backed, et cetera, in sports generally. Sports is probably the major thing that's keeping the traditional television industry alive. And just gobs and gobs of money, not just on pro sports and new franchises and gigantic new stadiums and stuff, but frankly, also new sports altogether, or underrepresented sports that have been, shall we say, newly discovered. I mean, I don't know if we need 4 pickleball leagues, but to see women's sports, or women's soccer league, and just, there's a whole bunch of sort of concepts and stuff, even things that were tried in the 80s and 90s, like slam ball, which is not really a sport, but, is coming back and being reinvested in. I guess the question in there is, I think you could sort of see me teeing it up from the behind my back here is, do you think there's an opportunity again, either in a franchise model like you're talking about, or some kind of television spectacle kind of scenario? Because Lord knows there's plenty of money and interest and media opportunity to do this perhaps again. Do you think there's an opportunity to bring this back in either the heyday version of the 60s and early 70s, or a legit version or some combination thereof? Do you ever feel like there's going to be another opportunity to take another swing at this?
Well, your points about how sports has become such a big deal to television that almost television needs sports more than sports needs it. And it's kept that medium going, and these others, the WNBA now is viable and obviously making a lot of money, and players are being paid. And before it was really just it was scraping by also. So you're right about that. There's tremendous opportunity, and I believe that it's the biggest opportunity in the sports world. And I'm shocked that nobody has taken advantage of it up to this point, or when they did, it was very limited into what they did. They had a limited connotation of what they could do with the sport, how far it could go. They weren't going to travel with it, kind of like the rock and roller games thing, right? 1989. And with the gimmicks and everything, and then it didn't tour. It was all done in one arena. This could be, I have no doubt, having seen it with my own eyes, how big it was and how fans clamored for it. It could be just as big as some of the major sports. It would take somebody with that vision, and it would take somebody with an understanding that it didn't fail because it's a failed sport. It's not a viable sport. It failed because the owners that were involved in it at the time didn't have enough vision to see where it could go. And it doesn't need any gimmicks. It just needs to be the same sport that it was, but it needs to be franchised. I believe that it will not work as a completely legitimate sport. From a just athletic standpoint, it's very difficult to play roller derby the way they're doing it in the amateurs and make it exciting enough to become a professional sport again. I don't think it will. So it would have to be a mix. It would have to be a sports entertainment thing that would pull people from hockey, from wrestling, from people that just like a lot of action but aren't turned off by a little bit of sports entertainment. And obviously, I was always shocked to see how huge wrestling got. In the 70s when we were skating at the Olympic, wrestling was in there the night after us or the night before, drawing smaller crowds at that time than our comeback league was drawing. And then suddenly, of course, the investment that went into that sport and the vision that they had to make it huge it even blew my mind. And it blew my mind that roller derby wasn't the first sport for them to do that. And now, big difference being that I think the cost of doing a roller derby game with the number of participants that you have to suit up. So you're talking, 25, as I mentioned before, or so, 26 skaters. That's a big difference than, one-on-one wrestling. Of course, it's become so huge now they can bring in an entourage of wrestlers and so forth for every show. But to get it started, you're talking about 25 to 30 skaters just starting out. It just can't be played with much less than that. So I think that's a hindrance. But there is now a guy by the name of Roy Engelbrecht, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who is bringing it back. And he's got training sessions that are going to open up in Costa Mesa next month. And it seems like he's a veteran sports promoter. I think he's done a lot of boxing and other things. And he's calling it Extreme Roller Derby. And I think it's the best chance for it to come back in a long, long time. So maybe I think they'll probably train skaters for 6 months at least before having a game. But I think, yeah, it's out there. The people know there's money to be made, just like you said. And I think it's finally has a chance to happen. But will they make the same mistakes that have been made with other leagues that tried to come back, that seemingly didn't believe the sport itself could sustain itself and tried to make it strictly a television sport, no franchises, no touring? That's what it's potentially looking like. But I think it could still be very big, and maybe they could expand beyond that point once it got going. But
do you have any sense? Do you have any sense that there's any copyrights out there? Like, is roller games like a trademark thing, or even roller derby for that matter, or is it kind of just, or because arguably any reboot, right, would benefit, I think, from the authenticity perhaps of one or more of the original concepts and trademarks and the like.
Well, roller derby now, as far as I understand, can be used by anyone. It would be in the public domain at this point. Roller games, I'm not as sure as to where that is right now. It's probably out there in the public domain as well. But the sport is known as roller derby, and it's a great name, anyways, for a rough and tumble sport like that. I think, the roller games did not have the choice to use the words roller derby, except later when seltzers folded up. But I think everybody's going to want to use the word roller derby, and then they'll create a league. Whoever's going to try to bring it back, like Roy is calling it extreme roller derby, so that'll be the name of his franchise or whatever you call it. So yeah. Let's hope they can do it right and bring it back. It could easily go way beyond what it was in the heyday. There's no reason why, because I always felt that this thing is being held back. And I could feel with the crowd sizes and the enthusiasm of the crowds that there's so much potential there. And it was never manifested as the way it should have been. And, you think about the merchandising today, the merchandising side of it. There was never T-Bird uniforms for sale. They would have sold like hotcakes. And that whole side of the money thing just never happened. And nowadays, of course, it would. So yeah, the potential is unlimited.
Yeah, that's almost the first thing that people think of for the actual product. It's interesting too. You mentioned Roy Engelbrecht. I mean, this is the guy. I mean, he's for those outside of the Southern California area. I mean, this guy's a promoter, boxing and fight, UFC style, just various forms of things. And he's had his scrapes with various regulatory boxing commissions and that kind of stuff. But he's also the guy that infamously, a couple of months ago, floated this idea of the irrelevant bowl, which in essence would have been, will be, who knows? I mean, with the collapse of the NCAA and the college football shenanigans that are going on, the idea of taking the two worst college football teams and having a bowl game. And why not? Because there are already like 43 bowl games of legit kind of thing. But, okay. So that sounds a little out there, right? So I'd hope that this would be a little bit more seriously taken. But it does speak to the fact that, there's always going to be, and look, we've seen outgrowths of that in various conversations of ours in various sports and forgotten things and stuff. History doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. And a lot of these things from the past can be brought back to life. But to your point, with prudence, intelligence, a little bit more business savvy, the franchise versus sole ownership thing, the television, the video, the media opportunities, all that kind of stuff, digital merchandising of stuff. This feels to me, based on what you experienced personally and our little road trip down memory lane from the historical perspective, the whole idea of roller derby, roller games, the sport, the entertainment, the spectacle, anybody who could just go on YouTube and look at sort of what this thing was will absolutely and quickly understand that this is very much something that could come back to life in a new modern kind of way and not skip a beat. In many respects, I think that's what this story and this conversation have been about. I'd love to see it, frankly, and it sounds like you would too.
I'd be thrilled if it was done right, because again, it never reached its ultimate potential. And after seeing what has happened with pro wrestling, it's just unbelievable how well that was done. It was also on the scrap heap. It wasn't doing well, but then somebody had the vision to take it. And they didn't change the fundamental aspects of what they were doing. they just glamorized it, and they put all the trimmings on it, but the sport was the same. And that's what should happen with roller games. Unfortunately, though, there was so many failures in the comeback. So many people have tried to bring it back and failed for various reasons that had nothing to do with the core sport. And if it was to fail again, it could be decades or maybe never that somebody else would come in and want to invest in it. So every time somebody does come along, I just have to hope they do it right. I'm 100% certain that this could be absolutely huge. So if I see any gimmicks or things where they're trying to make it something it doesn't need to be, then I get a little queasy and I worry about that. But all of us who have been part of it and seen it just go down the tubes after a certain point have also distanced ourselves from it a little bit mentally, because we've seen it fail too many times. We've been through that heartache. We were all pretty brokenhearted from when it did fall apart, even if we weren't still skating. It was sad to see it. It was sad to see the veteran skaters having nothing. Some of them in their 40s and 50s who were in management positions or whatever that now just had nothing, and their whole life had been invested in roller derby. So it was pretty heartbreaking. But I hope that Roy and his group can bring it back and do it right. I'm inspired by some of the things I'm hearing. So we'll have to see. Little concerned about this ramp that they've got set up. And the idea of this giant ramp to bring the jammers in, it'd be very hard to tour with that ever. It's something that would get old pretty quickly because it's the same ramp every time. So once skaters learn how to navigate that, it's reminiscent of rock and roller derby in 1989, where they had the wall of death and the figure eight thing that was too big. You couldn't tour with that. It had to be set up in one arena. So it wasn't viable for the long run. And so I'm a little concerned about the ramp because I just don't think it's needed. And after a while, if you watch rock and roller games, and I did with, one eye closed and, wasn't my thing. But when you watched it after a while, it wasn't exciting to see the skaters trying to get up that ramp. At least for me, it was the same old thing. Certain skaters could get up to the top line. They had the ability. Other skaters never did. And it was the same. And the little jumps that they had, which came off on television as being small jumps, they probably weren't that small or that easy for skaters, especially new skaters. But after a while, it's just gimmicky. It's not the sport. The sport can sustain itself as it is. And I wish people going into it would get that point and know the history that we were selling out everywhere we were going. But then, the other side of that coin is, if we were selling out everywhere, so, why did it not continue? Why didn't we just continue doing that same game? And part of the reasons it got overly theatrical. There was no investment. So they had limited amounts of money. So they had skaters that did not belong on the track. So it's anything they did that was theatrical didn't look right, because skaters that were trying to execute it oftentimes didn't have the talent to do it right. So people would come out and go, oh, this is crap. I can see right through this. And in the later 80s, there was a time when the skaters were getting older and there was no training. The training facility had closed. So literally roller games did not have a training facility. There were no new skaters. Everybody was getting old, and it was bound to fail. It had no investment. And nobody was looking for investment because nobody was looking to delegate or to give part ownership to somebody else willing to come in and invest. So it never happened. But anybody going into it now really needs to know that history and realize that if they've got the money and they're willing to delegate and do the things that I've mentioned, and I did a significant chapter in the book on this, they have a real chance for big, big success, in my opinion.
Well, from your mouth to God's ears, let's hope, right? It's a fascinating thing for me, and I appreciate you allowing us to use you as the excuse to kind of finally get into this topic, and perhaps maybe even another opportunity to go even deeper in some more some of the figures that we talked about, the names, and some of the other maybe idiosyncrasies of this. But let's give you some time to promote the book. Where else besides the book around this? I know you've got a nice website and stuff, and then the current day job, and what it looks like is sort of the world's best party band. Tell us all about that stuff.
Well, the book. Thank you, appreciate it. But the book is available on Amazon, and I would say that if somebody was a fan of the T-Birds, they're going to love the book. That's generally what I'm hearing. If there were somebody, let's say like yourself, who wasn't deeply immersed in it back in those days, then it's a bit historical context. There are certain chapters that anybody would love. I think I had sent you a list of those. But if you're a T-Bird fan listening in and you haven't read the book, or a roller games fan, or even, big into professional roller derby, either league, I think that you'd really enjoy the book. As far as what I'm doing these days, I'm managing Liquid Blue, and Liquid Blue has become the preeminent party band in the world at this point. So I started off doing it. It was a cover band. I was a weekend warrior. We just wanted to have some fun playing music. I had been in bands since the T-Bird days. As a matter of fact, when I had a band called the Electric Warrior back in those years, and I was managing, and I was a singer of the group. And whenever the T-Birds would skate, the band would notice that there was no gigs booked. And I think they started, since I was the guy booking it, they probably started to get a little suspicious. But I couldn't do both in the same night, and the T-Birds often skated on Saturday night. But I've been doing the music for a long time. I sang with Liquid Blue for about 15 years, and then I bowed out and hired younger singers. And the thing has just gotten to a point where they're doing 80 to 100 shows a year, and they are traveling all over the world. We've played in over 100 countries at this point. And it's being in a cover band is just a whole different ballgame now than it was growing up, where it was almost looked down upon. We play, I hire guys that tour with national acts. Our guitar player plays with the singer of Toto and the singer Mark Farner from Grand Funk, and we've got people that play with Katy Perry, and that level talent is in the group. And so if you want to see that, it's liquidblueband.com online. But I think your audience is a sports audience, so it's just been nice to have the opportunity to talk about the T-Birds and plug the book a little bit. And I do all of this stuff in regards to the T-Birds and Rolling Thunder, the book, out of love. This isn't a source of income that's going to really impact me that much. My main gig right now is Liquid Blue, but I'll always love roller derby and how it felt to be part of that back in those days. So I try to convey that in the book as best I can. What an exciting sport it was. If I could go back in time and go visit any sport I could, go back in time and attend a game, I'm sure I would choose a roller derby game, probably above anything. And I am a diehard Lakers fan. To this year, just waiting to see where they're going to end up in the playoff run. And I was a diehard Charger fan, and I still am. But I'd pick a roller derby game where there was great skaters and a packed house, because the noise from the audience, the excitement at a roller derby game, I don't know if it can be matched from my experience. And I've followed all the sports. So.
All right, here's my last question. Here's my pleasure. Here's my last question, sort of on the way out here. Where's the documentary on all this? Like either historical or the streaming series, or T-Birds, or the sport generally, or the league, or just seems like there's so many different potential storylines. Documentary, yes, but also maybe an inspired a genre or time inspired series, dramatic or comedic, or both.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, Tim, that there would be that potential. A lot of people have mentioned that to me. And I think that the story of the T-Birds and roller game is quite compelling. We can't cover it all today, but it was really an inspiring story, and a story where everything collapsed and then it made this incredible comeback, and then it collapsed again, and there's a lot of heartache, and it's the drama is a high level, and I think it's possible for that. But I'm not out seeking that, or I don't. Nobody's called me to say, hey, let's do a movie on your book, even though friends are always saying that should happen, but who knows. It's a great story. If somebody does it at some point, whether I'm involved or not, I would love to see it if it was done right, because it's just an amazing story.
All right.
And
Well,
heartbreaking.
if somebody from this conversation and they buy the book and all that kind of stuff, if it can be traced to us in the process, we'll get 10%. How about that? That's fair.
Absolutely, Tim.
No, but I agree. I mean, I totally and in a world where streaming is so pervasive, and there have been lesser stories, shall we say, that have made it to the screen or into the documentary realms. This one is certainly much more worthy of both those kinds of treatment. So you never know who listens to this show. I mean, that's really we get all kinds of inbound from all kinds of folks and stuff. So you never know, and don't be surprised if you get an email from me at some point from somebody wanting to connect with you and all that kind of stuff. So, and last question, how about on social media and stuff? So I've got your you got your latbirds.net website, right, for the book?
Yeah, latbirds.net. That's got the whole history of the T-Birds. That's a pretty comprehensive website, and it's got team pictures from every year that they were in existence. That's a lot of fun. And then we're on social media, on Facebook, Los Angeles Thunderbirds, on Instagram, Los Angeles Thunderbirds, I think, as well. Let me check. Selena, is that right? Instagram, Los Angeles.
Yeah, it's on your website too. I see the buttons there. Nothing on Twitter X or any other places, right?
No, it's just those two.
Okay.
Those two places for the most part.
Great. We'll point people to those too. Why not, right?
And TikTok. We're on TikTok as well. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, and God forbid, we'll actually help you sell a couple of extra books for the with some new audience and stuff. So you'd be surprised how many books and inquiries we generate and stuff. So
that's outstanding. And I'm forgetting the most important place we are online, which is our YouTube page. And on the YouTube page, you can see full-length games, and you can also, we've put together skater highlight reels, and it's the only place where you can see this. So we'll do a minute or two, or even up to 10 minutes on a specific skater, and those highlights are there. So if you have a favorite skater you want to see, I recommend the skater highlight reels to see the best talent and how it could be, because those reels, all the crap is cut out, the skaters that shouldn't be there and so forth. This is where the talent level would be if the thing was ever brought back in the right way. You'd have this tremendously talented skaters, and you can see those on our YouTube page. And one last thing is that back in the day, we had a harder time finding good female talent than we did male talent. There were just more men that wanted to go out for the league, because back in the 70s and 60s, females didn't feel as empowered to sports the way they do today. It was a whole different time period. So fewer of them were interested in it. But today, if this new league gets off the ground, what they're going to find is there's more good female skaters out there today that have played in these other leagues, in the amateur leagues, that are at a high level on their skates. They can do a lot of things on them, and they're going to have no trouble finding amazing female talent to go along with that male talent. So
it's ironic. It's basically flipped the script, right? It's almost it's much more of a female dominated amateur scene than on the male side. So it's just interesting how over the years that sort of that script has flipped.
Absolutely.
Endlessly fascinating, and I appreciate Scott tolerating my relative naivete when it comes to this thing known as roller derby or roller games or whatever you want to call it, banked roller things, whatever. Just fascinating stuff. The book, must get, really, really endlessly interesting, and more intrigue than it could be encapsulated in just this 1.5 hour episode. It's called Rolling Thunder, the golden age of roller derby and the rise and fall of the LA T-Birds, also known as the Los Angeles Thunderbirds. It is published by iUniverse. It has been out since October of 2019, and I encourage you to run, not walk, to get yourself a copy of this book and learn all about what we just talked about and then some. It is available in paperback or hardcover or Kindle versions, and you can find the convenient link on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, and just search up this episode number 346 with our new pal Scott Stevens, and you will find a convenient link, of course, to the book, and we'll get a couple of nickels or dimes occasionally of referral love for doing so. We appreciate that. Helps keeps our lights on and stuff, and we appreciate that to no end. You can follow Scott's endeavors in his quest to keep the history of the LA T-Birds alive, various places online at latbirds.net, latbirds.net. You can also follow his and their news and offerings on all kinds of social feeds, such as TikTok and Facebook and Instagram and YouTube at Los Angeles Thunderbirds, all one word. Los Angeles Thunderbirds, all one word. You can also follow Scott's prolific, I guess they call themselves America's most prolific party band. It's called Liquid Blue. They're at liquidblueband.com, liquidblueband.com. Hire them for your local gathering in your town or neighborhood, perhaps a private party or so. Liquid Blue, coming to a town near you and partying it up at that. Another way to support Scott beyond just buying the book. Support us, of course, by going to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, as aforementioned. And lots of good stuff there. All of our previous episodes, they're available for you to stream. Of course, the best way to get our shows is to subscribe or follow us on whatever podcast feed mechanism that you choose. But please, of course, if you can, give us a rating or review, preferably 5 stars or a 10 rating out of 10 or whatever the mechanism is. That helps other people like you discover us, find us, be recommended us to add to their feeds, and so on and so on. While you're on the website, go to our merch page. Relatively new stuff. We've got convenient links to our friends at royalretros.com, and we've got a convenient link to our friends at oldschoolshirts.com. But of course, you can buy our own merch through our site link there at TeePublic. You can get unique merch featuring our podcast logo, as well as a nicely curated bunch of stuff from various forgotten and defunct and relocated teams and leagues of the past on whatever kinds of clothing or bumper stickers, mugs, magnets, all kinds of stuff through that link there on our merch page, again, at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Follow us on social media. We're at Good Seats Still on the Twitter X thing. And we're at Good Seats Still Available on Facebook and Instagram and Threads. Also on YouTube, by the way. Check us out on YouTube. You can send us email. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And our tip of the roller skate laces this week to our pal Jerry Payne. Jerry Payne, audio excellence. And once again, fine knob twiddling this week. We appreciate it, kind sir. We appreciate you, of course, listening as well and supporting the show. We appreciate you doing that. And until next week, we encourage you to hopefully enjoy a little bit of spring. And until then, we'll see you right here on this very feed. Take care.